Hello, hello, and greetings, International Studies 200 students. Welcome back. This is Dr. Foster, and we're here starting week 3, and I'm going to give you a short discussion of the readings for this week. That is Chapter 2 in our textbook, Introduction to International and Global Studies on History. And then you also have a PowerPoint that you're going to view and listen to. It's got some audio clips on the second reading we have for this week, which is a PDF by Baldwin and Quinn called Defining Imperialism and Colonialism. So last week, we talked in pretty great detail and read about what we could say what of globalization. That is, we covered through the Croucher PDF reading in our discussion a number of different definitions of globalization, from the very general to the very specific. We covered the main elements of globalization, from economic to political to cultural and so on. And in that reading, we also talked about debates around globalization, how scholars have characterized it. Is it good or bad? When was it? Does it increase democracy, and so on and so forth? And we got a chance, for those of you that could make it to the live discussion, to discuss some of those issues and to clarify some of those issues. So we're actually going to continue on with that discussion, but we're going to focus this week mostly on the when of globalization, i.e. the history or prehistory of globalization, and sort of trying to tackle the question of when was globalization, or when did it start, rather. We're still in globalization, right? Are there different eras of globalization? And so kind of hitting that when. So if you'll turn to page 31 in our reading for today, that's in the textbook, I actually wanted to start at the very end. Usually you start at the very beginning of a chapter. I want to start at the very end and use this pithy statement to frame not just our readings for this week, but our discussion throughout. And at the very top of page 31 in their conclusion, they say, world history matters. World history matters in international studies because without it, we cannot understand the international system, including the origins of the nation state and globalization, two key forces in current international affairs. So if we're trying to understand the world right now and the problems facing it, given that we are in a global condition and we are in globalization, we could say, it's so important to study history, particularly the way in which history tells us about the origin of globalization, as they say here. When was it? How did we get here? And the only way to understand the problems facing us today, and the only way to understand how we can characterize and understand the situation itself, is to go back and look at history. So history is very important. So I wanted to start at the end there to give you a sense of another aspect of our sort of critical thinking, our critical lenses. Always very, very important to study the history of the things that we're trying to understand, and not just the contemporary issues and problems and concepts facing us. So world history matters. We're going to start there. I'm going to start today with Africa. And you may think, okay, so that's sort of a weird place to start, given that we're going to go this week and into the following weeks with the history of Europe and conquest and imperialism, the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism and neo-colonialism, and how important that is in the study of globalization. But I want to actually start with Africa for a couple of reasons. It gives us a sense of the history of the interconnectedness of the world, and it gives us a sense of not only proto-globalization or early globalization or the origin of globalization, but it also gives us a kind of critical lens through which to read European empire and imperialism and the things that would follow. So we're going to start with a quote by E.W. Blyden. E.W. Blyden is actually from the Caribbean, but he spent most of his life writing about politics and philosophy in Africa. So he actually spent most of his life in Liberia, which is on the west coast of Africa. And he wrote this book in 1886, so a long time ago, well over 100 years ago. But I wanted to start with that because it gives us a good sense of globalization or early globalization or pre-globalization, whatever you want to call it. And he defines Africa in this way. He says that Africa is no vast island separated by an immense ocean from other portions of the globe, and cut off through the ages from the men who have made and influenced the destinies of mankind. She has been closely connected, both as a source and nourisher, with some of the most potent influences which have affected for good the history of the world. The people of Asia and the people of Africa have been in constant intercourse. No violent or political disruption has ever broken through this communication. No chasm caused by war has suspended this intercourse or interconnectedness. Africans are continually going to and fro between the Atlantic Ocean and the Red Sea, and so on and so forth. And so that's a quote from a chapter from this book called Africa's Service to the World. And I wanted to pause on that, and I want to think about that quote. But as good critical thinkers, we need to know not just what a person is saying, but why. Okay, so let's talk about what he's saying there. And he's saying this at the end of the 19th century, as we approach the 1900s, approach the 20th century. And what he's saying is that we already have an interconnected and global world. So he's talking about how Africa and different places in Africa are in constant intercourse, as he says, with all of the different areas around it, from to the east, India and the Indian Ocean world, to the north, Mediterranean, and there's been a constant sort of flow there. And so really what we want to do is kind of go back and take a hint from Croucher, who, as we remember, defined globalization as a kind of intensified interconnectedness in all sorts of ways. And really what Blyden's giving us a picture of here is a sort of global interconnectedness of Africa to other places in the world, right? And at that time, Europe is also connected to other places, the Americas, and so on and so forth. But he's also interestingly giving us sort of examples of economic interconnectedness. He talks about trade, political, he talks about politics, and cultural globalization as well, because he's talking about flows of people, intercourse between people. And when people meet each other, they learn about their own languages, their own cultures, religions, and so on and so forth. And there's a sort of exchange, a cultural exchange. So interestingly enough, you get sort of a picture of globalization here from this quote by the father of what we could call Pan-Africanism in 1886. So he's talking about not globalization in the modern sense that we've known it, that really happens after the Cold War, but a kind of early globalization. And it's an early globalization that centers Africa as a place that's interconnected and that both is a source and nourisher of the world. And this is an incredibly brilliant thing to say for reasons that we can get into. But also, I want to go back and ask the second question. So that's the what, right? That's what he's saying. But why is he saying it? Why is he saying it, and why is he starting with Africa? Well, this gets us back to the sort of brief conversation we had yesterday about myth-making, and that you read about this week in the beginning of the chapter on history, chapter 2, and national and other forms of myth-making. By the time he's writing this, Europe and the nation states in Europe are already well on their way to being global, colonial, or imperial powers. And those imperial powers, as they were colonizing the rest of the globe, you'll read, and I referenced this last week, but you'll read in the Baldwin and Quinn essay that they quote Edward Said saying, so by 1914, Europe had colonized 85% of the globe, right? So this is already, this process is already well underway by the time that Blyden is writing and thinking about the world. And in fact, so much so that he's actually responding to it. So this gets us to the question of the why. Why is he saying this, and why is he centering Africa? Well, Europe and its empire and imperial processes carried with it ideas that would become dominant ideas, right, or ideologies of the time, particular to Europe. And it would come, and there would be a sort of Eurocentric bent on these ideas. And one of the ideas that actually would help justify the colonization of places like Africa is that Africa and places like it are primitive, backwards, they're sort of back in time. And this is the idea of Africa as kind of like the heart of darkness. That's a famous novel from 1900, right about the same time that Blyden is writing, by Joseph Conrad, who you might have heard of. If anybody's an English major, you've probably heard of that, Heart of Darkness. But that title is taken from a dominant kind of discourse of the time about Africa as this place of darkness, this place that's cut off and back in time. And these are all negative images. So back to what Blyden is doing is he's actually responding to what we could now call a racist stereotype. A stereotype that says Africa and Africans are this thing, there's the other thing that are not as good as Europe. He's saying, in fact, that's not true. It's not isolated, and it's central in terms of this sort of interconnectedness that we've been talking about. And so when we talk about early globalization, Blyden would say that Africa is as good as any place to start. So we can certainly start with Europe. We can start with other places. We can start with East Asia and China. And you can kind of historicize the interconnectedness of these places. But Africa is a good place to start as any, and what it does is kind of give us a critical sense of a response to some of the myths that empire and imperialism would bring with it. And some of those myths actually persist today. Some of those myths actually persist today in different ways, and that have kind of changed and evolved. But when you think about stereotypes in that kind of way, you can think about that. And so we've sort of not just kind of given an example of early globalization, but we've talked about the what and why of the Blyden quote there, different kinds of interconnectedness. We got a sense of the importance of imperialism and conquest, dating back hundreds of years as sort of proto-globalization or the beginnings of globalization. And we talked about myths, and I want to give you a couple quotes from the readings today. So if we could go back to chapter 2 on history, page 12, just to give you a bit more kind of concrete information about what this myth making is. And we did talk about invented identities and things, and we'll continue to discuss that. But if you look on the top of page 12, please follow along, and then bottom of page 13, they say that our knowledge of the world has been shaped by the stories we have been told and by the contexts that we live in. So knowledge is shaped, right? While many would say that there is an absolute set of true facts regarding world events, others would argue that the lenses we put on shape both what we see and what we look for. And then on the bottom of 13, governments care about how you understand the past because it shapes your decisions politically and your engagement in the world around you. Because multiple forces will try to shape your understanding, it is very important to learn to critically interpret the past. So world history matters, but it's important to also put on those lenses of critical reading or critical thinking that we talked about in order to examine or study those events without being subject to a kind of narrative, a national narrative or some sort of narrative or agenda, right? So it's important to be able to kind of pick these things out and be able to objectively study the past. So again, it's very important to learn to critically interpret the past. but that at the same time world history matters. And so in this section, they give two examples, and I want you to go take a careful look at these to see how this happens, how governments kind of shape or rewrite or edit history to their own benefit. And they give the example of Brazil and Iran, and I want you to go back and study these. I'm not going to go over them, but I want you to study these as examples of this kind of myth making. But to continue on page 14, if we could move on, we do have to acknowledge the fact that when we're talking about the origin of globalization or early globalization or pre-globalization, we do have to focus on Europe because European empires and colonialism and imperialism, the transatlantic slave trade, and other forces like that were so important in the violent and often oppressive uniting of the world into a single whole. And that uniting of a world into a single whole goes back to that interconnectedness of globalization. And so we have to start there. But I want you to take note of this fact on page 14 at the very top. The authors say that if a dispassionate observer had studied the globe in the 14th century, it would have been unlikely that he or she would have chosen Europe as the region that would dominate international affairs for the next 5 centuries. So if you go back to the 14th century, in other words, what they're saying is that there's nothing that would suggest that Europe would come to be this power. The other places, Islam in the Middle East, China in East Asia, and other places around the world were actually further along in terms of development and empire and all sorts of other things. And there's a few reasons that they give, and we can talk about these, why Europe rose at the time that it did, and how we get to imperialism, colonialism, and all of these sort of early moments in globalization that we must study in order to understand the win of globalization. So I also want you to pay very close attention to this section, because it's going to give you those reasons, it's going to give you those prehistories. So I want you to study those, and then write down any questions that you have, write down any comments that you have. I want you to be able to use those, i.e. participate later on. Again, at that period, it's important to study early conquest, exploration, imperialism, colonialism, transatlantic slave trade, and all of these are different forces driven by, we'll talk about what they're driven by. But it's important to note, and this is on page 18, that it was in this period that created modern ideas of race in which social class and standing were mapped onto skin color. So that's something I want you to very, very carefully consider, and this is on page 18 again. It was in this period that created modern ideas of race in which social class and standing were mapped onto skin color. And they say that in this period, conceptions of race appeared, and that these conceptions continue to shape social and political issues today. Even back then, they mention, and this is towards the bottom of page 18, there were some individuals that questioned both these categories and questioned slavery itself. So there were folks who criticized the absolute violence, not just of the brutality of the transatlantic slave trade and the violence of imperialism and colonialism, but also these ideas of race itself, which were invented in a way to justify subjugation, justify colonization, justify conquest. And there were some folks that were critical of this. However, and this is key, the wealth created by slavery was so central to European empires that economic interests outweighed moral concerns. So this is also very important to pay attention to, and this is on the bottom of page 18. Economic interests outweighed moral concerns. So that is an important fact that we need to understand when we go back and look at world history, particularly the history of conquest, the transatlantic slave trade, colonialism, and imperialism. And we also need to take note of the fact that this is when ideas, or our modern ideas of race, were invented. I use that term in the same way that Croucher does in the PDF last week. Invented doesn't mean fake, and it doesn't mean that race has very real, concrete, and institutional organizing power now. It does. You can just tell from reading the news that race and racism are very powerful and very real. However, the idea of race as a central biological category that actually separates humans into different kinds of people, that's invented. That idea is invented and spread, and it's a product of society, right, rather than a product of biology. Okay? So when we look at world history, we also have to look at things like this. And again, it's important to take note that in this period, modern ideas of race were created or invented, right? And they still exist today, but in different forms, but they're still extant. So I hope that you've gotten a little bit more of an idea about the history of globalization, where we need to start, and some of the issues. Again, this has been fairly brief, but we'll continue on with this. And also an idea of how myths or ideologies work, myth making, particularly as we mentioned this ideology of race. In the PowerPoint in the Baldwin and Quinn, it's going to be very important for you to pay attention to this concept of ideology, what it is, how it works. And you're going to get more into detailed descriptions about how imperialism and colonialism work in that PDF. After you've read that very carefully, please do take a look at my PowerPoint on that particular article. And so again, we've got the 2 readings this week. What we'll do is after you've done all that work, I want you to come prepared to participate in our live discussion, which will be on Thursday again. We met and had a great discussion. I would like a little bit more participation, and I would like a little bit more conversation as a group rather than just at me. So please come prepared for that. Again, if you're in section 002, those sessions are required. If you're in the section 801, those are optional, so they're not required for you to attend. I suggest you do if you can. There's a great resource for you, and it's going to just help you out, but they're not required. Section 002, for the most of you, it is required, so I'll see you then. I look forward to your online comments, and I look forward to your attendance and seeing you in those live discussions so we can discuss all this more. We've got a lot to discuss, but just to go back to the very beginning, world history matters. If we want to know anything about globalization, international affairs, nation states, and the world at large now, world history matters. Okay, so that's our discussion for this week. We'll see you, and be well. I appreciate you.